Alright, so now let's go in and start adding our foam here. So for our foam to work, we want to save our spectra of our geometry here. So we just want to go in here and save this to disk. That's saving out all the information of our ocean here. And we're going to need that for our ocean foam. So if we take a look at our ocean foam, we got two ways to create particles. We've got the solver and emitter. And emitter is going to be a traditional way to emit particles based off the surface. And we could use those later in, say, another simulation or something like that for extra splashes. If we wanted to simulate particles off these particles. And we've also got solver, and this is what the shader is going to pick up to actually render and use this foam. So we've got things like the life expectancy, the variance, drift rate, how it's going to be stretched and squashed on the surface of the ocean, the foam density and the preservation rate, and kind of some standard attributes for the lifespan and that of the particles. And then our start frame, how many substeps, and things like that. So we're going to want to keep this on solver, and then we're going to generate these particles, and then we're going to be able to use that. The shader is going to pick it up all from here. And under the emission, if we just scroll this to the bottom and say if we wanted to spit out these particles as actual particles and use them in another package or anything and just cast out the particles as they are, we want to consider displacing these particles here, and that's going to place them on the actual surface of the water based on the displacement. So when we bring in those particles, they're actually going to be displaced. Okay, so first of all, if we take a look at how we're emitting here, we've got an overall density. One thing to note is when you're creating these particles, you're instantly going to see that we're not going to be able to see any particles here. And usually that's because of a couple things. Usually it's the Z density fall off. Really, for us to see anything, we want to reduce this at least, say, by half. But this is going to be based off of our camera here. So we've got the option to create particles on the entire grid of our 8,000 unit surface ocean, which is going to be way too much and super heavy, so I really don't want to click on this grid here. I want to keep it to camera. It's going to be a lot more efficient. And let's just kind of go into our camera here and kind of roughly ballpark an area that we think our shot's going to be. So we've got to consider what our camera movement's actually going to be within this shot. And I know that, maybe we're going to start down here and kind of zoom in, twirl around to look at our volcano. So for this, I'm going to just kind of place our camera roughly where, I think we're going to have it, somewhere around here. So now I can determine at least a near and a far plane where we want to burst some particles. So also, if we just kind of take a look, the height of our camera is somewhere around here, and the ocean's around here. So we really only need particles to start maybe around 500 units from the camera, since we're not directly, we're a little bit above the ocean surface itself. And then based on the distance of our scene here, I know that, say, probably around 3,000 units in the distance I want to place particles. You'll see we're still not seeing anything because we're fading this off way too much. So by default, this should probably be down to 0.5 or something. So if we were to initially set this to 0.5, you'll see now we're calculating. We're going to start to burst some particles here. And this is all going to be based off of the distance of our camera that we've set up. So when you're kind of working towards the end of your shot, you'll notice there's a couple of things that we need to kind of set up as we go along. Things like, let's get a placement of our camera a little bit better so we roughly know where we're going to do that. Let's set up a little bit of a lighting scene so we can view things better. And for the displacement on the ocean, maybe we want to do a couple of renders to see how much detail we're actually getting at the displacement. And so for that, we might want to go and set up an actual cheap render so we can view that better while we keep moving things along. All right, so you'll see instantly we've created some particles based on our wave attributes and based off the Z fall off. So let's just go into our perspective camera. You'll see that, so we've created particles based on the camera. You see we're cutting it off down here. And then we're kind of fading it off in the distance. And really, I don't think we're probably not going to be able to notice any particles further than this based on the scale of the scene. So I feel this is about right. But if we were to change this fall off to 0.2, it's going to start fading even more. But I'm just going to leave it at 0.5. We're fading the particles a decent amount off here. So now for some of the most important areas of where we're going to be emitting, we've got a few different attributes. We've got the cusp, what I've talked about before, kind of the curvature of where we're going to be spawning those off the wave. So since we've increased our chop to 1, we're really going to get that cusp on the top of the wave quite a bit sooner and really easy. And then we can limit by velocity and by height. So if we just say turn on the height here, and maybe we had those really big rolling waves that we kind of played around with before, maybe we want to do a separate sim for those waves, and we could limit that based on the height since those waves were so much bigger. You know, so we could kind of layer up these different ocean foams as well. So you see now by adding the minimum height, we've reduced things further just into these little areas of the waves here. So that's pretty cool. So I'm going to keep things default as they are. I'm going to keep the particle density at 10, and I'm going to keep it as it was and take off the minimum height. And also, if you had a really high resolution ocean, you've got the option to downsample here in the ocean evaluation. That'll save a lot of time. So it's just one thing to note if things are really chugging on you and you got really high resolution and things maybe even be freezing or stuff like that. Maybe you want to downsample the wave so we're only creating the foam on a lower resolution grid. And then finally, I'm going to choose displace particles, and this is going to place the particles on the displaced ocean itself so we can use for later. Alright, so that's pretty much it. So I'm going to go ahead and bake this foam out. What I'm going to do is write this into its own, and I'm going to put it into its own folder, and I'm going to write out this entire sequence. So now let's kind of take a look at what's happening here. So if we take a look at our ocean preview, let's look at it with the foam on top. So I'm going to go to our bake foam here. Let's drag this to our merge foam. That's going to place this on top. And now we can do things like, and if these particles are a little bit big, let's press D in the viewport here, and we can change the point size of the points here. I'm going to change this to 1, and I'm just going to make the particles white. So I'm going to drop down a color node here, and afterwards place that. Now it's just going to make these particles white, and I can see this better on the surface. And maybe I'll increase the point size to 2. Alright guys, so we have our final flipbook here, and we can really get to see an idea of what's actually happening in the ocean and the scale of the waves, the speed, what the foam's doing. First of all, you can see that we're going to need a second of run up, as the foam lifespan is about a second. We're going to need a second to kind of let it sim before our shot begins. So to really encourage you, whenever you make any changes to things like the crest of the waves or anything, playblast the foam and have a look so you can really fine tune the areas of the foam where you want to emit from. Some of these parameters are pretty delicate when it comes down to things like the chop and the height of the waves. It's really going to make a difference on where and how much foam is going to be emitted. And I can really get to see about the scale of the waves that are hitting the side of the island there. So I'm liking kind of the speed and the scale of things.